Well, good afternoon, folks. This is my last time of this particular session, and all good things must come to an end, I suppose. I apologize again for cutting out a little early. If it didn't happen, this situation arose, I would be here through Friday night because this is a very fun conference. I have an opportunity to speak at conferences from time to time, and this is one of the most fun conferences. I really look forward to this one, and I hope the powers that be see fit to invite me back again soon. So I'm just really enjoying myself here. I'm going to wrap up with biblical cosmology. It's kind of the second part of my big problems with the Big Bang, and people ask me some questions between those talks, and I said, well, why don't you wait till tomorrow afternoon, and I'll kind of answer those questions for you. Before I do that, though, I want to share something with you. I just got an email about an hour and a half ago over lunch. Remember I told you the other day about a picture book I have coming out, a coffee table book coming out in the fourth quarter, just in time for Christmas. Well, the publisher's working on it, and they sent me a few sample pages. Do you want to see a few? Yeah, so I'll show you a couple here. This is one. It's a, now keep in mind, since it's a coffee table book, you open it up and you got 2 pages here. So you're looking at 2 pages, not 1 page. So you got some star trails, one that I took there in North Carolina. I did not show that one to you. And then we've got some other samples. Jim Bonser took the one on the upper right, and then the one on the lower right, that's the one I did show you from Arizona. So I didn't show you all my photos, and I didn't show you any of Jim or Glenn Fountain's either. Here's another one. This was taken by Deb and Jim Bonser. I showed you the one on the right. The one on the left his wife took. That's at the Creation Museum. That was the year before. I took them around at night taking pictures as best we could with the lights on. So you're seeing star trails as well there. So those are lovely images. I think I have one more. This is showing one of the pictures, a couple of pictures I already showed you that I took, one in Grand Canyon and the other one there at the camp in Arizona. So up in the White Mountains at 8,300 feet. So that's just a little foretaste of what the book's going to look like. Again, I have photos and essays as well to go in there. I'm not sure when it will come out, but I'm going to guess September, October probably would be when it's there. It's called The Heavens, A Different View. So look forward to looking for that. And again, in time for Christmas. I intend to give some away this year. Oh, one more. I'm sorry. I have one more. I did show you the one on the left. The one on the right, that was taken by Jim once again, showing you some of the Milky Way shots. And the one on the far right, that's one of Jim's as well, I believe. So plenty of photos you've not seen. The galaxy photos, I didn't show any of those because I don't have any good ones of those, but these other 2 fellows do, and they're just eye-popping. They're beautiful photos all the way around. All righty, I'm going to be overlapping a little with my previous talk. I defined cosmology for you. It's the study of the structure of the universe, and I pointed out that cosmogony oftentimes is confused with cosmology, or the two are kind of fused together. And as I look at the creation account, I can see 3 places where astronomical things are sort of mentioned. First of all, in the very first verse, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. That's the first mention of something astronomical. Then you skip forward to day 2, and there's this thing called the rakia that God made on day 2, verses 6 through 8. And then the third time is on the day 4 account where God made the luminaries, or I'd prefer to call them astronomical bodies. And that's kind of the gist of the astronomical things found in the first chapter of Genesis. So my job as a creation astronomer is to try to make sense out of all of these. And I wrestled for decades with this rakia. And I remember back when I was coming down the pike, half a century ago, I dedicated my life. I realized my calling was to be an astronomer, proclaiming creation to people and sharing God's glory as shown through astronomy. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I better try to figure out what's going on here. So I started reading with more intently ever before the first chapter of Genesis. And pretty quickly I got to this thing on day 2 that in the King James says the firmament. And I had no idea what that was, and nobody I knew could help me. You've got to keep in mind, this is a long time before internet. Do you realize there was such a time? When I was your age, we didn't have computers. And we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to school, all that kind of stuff. You know how that goes. So it was really a primitive time. We only had three TV stations, no cable, that kind of stuff. If you missed the TV show, You just missed it. It was gone. You couldn't recall or anything, but I digress. All right, you heard all those stories from your grandparents, right, or your parents. All righty. And one thing I want to caution about is there have been many attempts throughout history of Christians attempting to wed man's cosmology, the current cosmology of the day, to the cosmology of the Bible. And I'm going to give you two historical examples, and both times it led to disaster. It really did, and real problems. And my point is, well, I'll tell you what my point is. The celestial sphere, I alluded to that the other day, and I'm going to tell you more explicitly about that in a moment. Then the Tulamec Model, I talked about that a bit and what it caused, and I'll go in more detail as well. And these are lessons from history, because the emphasis today is to accept the Big Bang as the proper cosmology/cosmogony, and people want to read into Genesis 1 and the rest of Scripture, for that matter, the Big Bang cosmology. And I'm saying, well, hold on a minute. We've been down that road twice before, and it's caused nothing but problems. Why do you think it's going to work out any differently this time? And people, we should be comparing our man's ideas to Scripture, not the other way around. And that's the problem people have. Okay, the ancient Greek cosmology, I described that the other day. You have this spherical Earth there surrounded by a hard crystalline sphere to which the stars and the sun and the moon are attached, and the planets, and they move around us. Whether the Earth spins inside or the whole sky spins around, it doesn't matter. It looks the same regardless, because it's the same. It's a totally reversible process in all of this. Does anybody remember what kind of word you could use, Greek word you could use to describe this? What? Okay, but this particular model, what was the Greek word that they could use to describe this? Anybody remember? Very good. Someone back there. Who said it? Who? Oh, there you are. Okay, I thought it was farther back. Thank you. Stereoma. And that means what? Something hard. Yes. Now, that causes a lot of confusion, as I'll share with you in just a moment. So we got this celestial sphere. By the way, we still use this. I told you in my labs at the university, we use these for my teaching. I would take it to class and show them things. We had a couple of labs that my students do in the lab. And here at the Creation Museum, we do workshops where we put these globes out and we use them. But nobody that I know believes this to be true. It's useful, however, for showing certain things in the sky. For one thing, we believe the stars are various distances from us, not all the same distance. But when they get far enough away, it's as if they're all the same distance away from us. So it's a useful model, even though it isn't necessarily true. All right, the Septuagint. You know what the Septuagint is, right? Not everybody knows that. I have to educate a lot of groups. I'm seeing them nod of the head. It's the translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek. It was done in Alexandria, Egypt, 2nd, 3rd century BC. The reason for that is that Jews have been scattered in the Babylonian captivity, and they've gone all over the place, farther east of Mesopotamia, around the Mediterranean world, and a lot of them ended up in Alexandria. By that time, because of the Greek conquest, the language in that part of the world, the common language was Greek, and that's the reason why the New Testament was written in Greek. Well, this intertestament period, you had all these Jews out there. Many of them couldn't read or speak Hebrew anymore, and scriptures are very important to them. So the solution was to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into the common language that every educated person knew, and that language was Greek. We indicate the Septuagint by LXX, which is the Roman numerals for 70. And when they got to this Rakia, this thing that God made on day 2, they translated it as stereoma. Why did they do that? Well, I would suggest that they did that because they said God made this thing on day 2. We're going to see in a few moments that God filled it with the luminaries on day 4. Well, they were sitting there in the city of Greek culture and learning, Alexandria. That was it. It was a huge city. It was the great library was there. It was just a wonderful place of learning. If you wanted to go study, you could do no better place than Alexandria for many centuries at that time. And they said, look, we know what the cosmology is. The cosmology is this crystalline sphere out there to which the luminaries are attached. So obviously, on day 2, God made this crystalline sphere, and on day 4, he filled it with lights. Now, if that cosmology were true, then that would be a good thing, good translation. But the problem is, I don't think it is true. Nobody today, even flat earthers, in a fashion, don't think it's true either. So obviously, they mistranslated Scripture here, didn't they? They didn't just interpret Scripture in terms of their cosmology. They went a step further. They translated the Bible into that terms of that cosmology. And that's putting it in stone, more or less. Now, a few centuries later in the West, by the 4th century, 5th century, the Greek had fallen into disuse in the West. In the eastern part of the empire, it was still being used, but in the West, it was Latin. That was the Roman language. And many people, many Christians in the West couldn't read Greek anymore. They couldn't read Hebrew anymore. So both the Old and New Testament were unknown to them. So Jerome decides to translate both the Old and New Testament into Latin, putting it in the common language of the people. We call this the Vulgate because it means common. The word vulgar, it technically means common. It's come to mean something else now, but it means common. And so when he got to that, he knew some both Hebrew and some Greek, and he looked at it and he said, I think the cosmology was still there. He looked, when you do translation work, you don't work in a vacuum. You work and see what else has been done. And he was well aware of how the Septuagint had rendered it. And he realized the cosmology was still current. And so he voted with that. And so he used the Latin word firmamentum to get that. And if you want to know what that means, all you have to do is look at the first 4 letters. And that's where the English word firm comes from. So what Jerome has done is he has gone right along with what the Septuagint did, again endorsing a particular cosmology. Now, we go forward another 1,000 years. Latin falls into disuse, and finally by the late Middle Ages, nobody could read Latin except for some of the priests, and they weren't sharing it too much, so it was an unknown book once again. And so some forward-thinking people were starting to say, look, why don't we translate the Bible into the common language? And so one that did that was Wycliffe. And he's working late Middle Ages, wanting to translate the Bible into English. The problem is, he didn't know Greek, nor did he know Hebrew. He did know Latin. So which translation of the Bible did he use? He used the Vulgate, didn't he? And when he gets to this particular word in the translation, he doesn't know what to do with it. So what he did was he took a Latin word and simply transliterated it into English and created an English term, and that's why he rendered it firmament. A couple centuries later, you get other people who are translating, such as Tyndale, and the Geneva Bible, the King James, and the other many translations are being done. And again, you don't work in a vacuum. You see what other people have done. And for the next couple hundred years, everybody translates it firmament, 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 firmament. It really wasn't until someone in the 19th century that people began to realize maybe this is not the proper way to translate this. Now, this overlaps with flat earthers a bit. They say, aha, this word rakia means something hard, but that's not what it means at all. And in fact, Martin Luther, writing 500 years ago, he opined, he said, I don't know why they translated it stereoma, because it doesn't mean something hard. It means expanse. Martin Luther knew what it meant 500 years ago. So the notion that everybody thought it meant something hard is not true. Interesting. Does anybody know how Luther translated into German? The German word he used translates into English as stronghold, which I'm baffled by that translation. He knew what the word actually meant, but he didn't use the German word for expanse. Could be he learned the true meaning after he did his translation. I don't know. It's a mystery to me. I'd like to know how that works out. And this, in more modern translations even now, because of the influence of what I shared with you, the 19th century movements that led to the Flat Earth movement, That's even become a vaulted ceiling. I used to like the NIV. I used it for a number of years. I've lost confidence in it because they did a kind of a revision about 8 years ago. And when that revision, they started putting in vaulted ceiling for the rakia in chapter 1 of Genesis. Of all the bad translations, I think that has to be about the worst of the bunch. They had it right before expanse, and then they changed it to something even worse than firmament, I do believe. And that's telling you the insidious nature of some of that so-called scholarship on all of this. And this is still put forth as what Genesis and the rest of the Bible teaches, again, touching on the flat earth movement, but also in other areas as well. And this really caused me a lot of consternation because, as I said, when I started looking into this 50 years ago as a teenager, didn't have a lot of resources to know this. My dad didn't have much. I didn't know anybody who knew any better. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to figure out what this firmament was. I never could figure it out. And even later on, it was tricky. And I went for decades just kind of stumbling around trying to figure out what this was. By the way, this kind of plays into the hands of this kind of thinking. Anybody seen this engraving before? Okay, it's called the Flamerian Engraving. And what it's supposed to show is medieval thinking. You got a flat earth there. You got a dome sitting there on top of the earth. Flat earthers would love this. You've got the sun and the moon and the stars in that. And some intrepid explorer has made his way to the edge of the earth, found a hole, and he's looking through that hole, and he's seeing all the gears and stuff behind that, the real workings that God put there. And as I said, this is supposed to be a medieval engraving that shows medieval thinking based on what the Bible literally teaches. Does anybody know what year this was done? A while ago. Yeah, smack dab in the middle of the Middle Ages in 1888. Flamerian wrote this book on weather phenomenon, and that's where the thing comes from. But most people looking at this, that's got to be like 1200 or something. But no, it's 1888. It was at the height, or just the really beginning strongly of this attack on the authority of Scripture. So there's just a lot of fakery going on out there. This is not medieval at all, obviously. And I talked about, and again, I get back to this. It caused me nothing but consternation. This is a bad translation done 2,300 years ago, back when they did the Septuagint. And it's been mistranslation after mistranslation after mistranslation. It led me off the track for 30 years plus, and it's led to people today still misleading them. So people made a mistake. What they did is they took the cosmology of the day, and that was like in 300 BC, and they not only understood Scripture, but translated Scripture in light of that cosmology. And I submit to you, we're still living with the repercussions of that very bad decision to do that. So that should be a lesson to us not to endorse this sort of thing. Now, I'd mentioned the other night about the Tulamec Cosmology with the little epicycles, wheels upon wheels, to explain planetary motion. I don't need to go over that again, I don't believe, because I think I did a pretty good job of handling that. And this is basically an add-on. It's an app added to the stereoma model, the celestial sphere, because now it's addressing not so much stars, it's addressing that complex motion that planets go through. As I pointed out before, this was a very successful model for 15th century. It was geocentric, and later on it was adopted by the Roman Catholic Church through the influence of Thomas Aquinas. What happened is Augustine, in around 500 AD, became very influential in church history. He was a Neoplatonist. He took a lot of the ideas that Plato had and brought them in, and I think he brought some Greek mistakes in with that. So I hope I don't offend people here, but I think Augustine's a mixed bag. There's some good and there's some bad in all of this. And he was sprinkling in some man's ideas there. And Aquinas comes in a few centuries later, around 12th century, I think, 13th century, and I think 12th century, he takes the ideas then current, Aristotle's ideas, because I believe Plato was put forth by Augustine. Aristotle kind of got put in the back bench for a little while, but Aristotle comes roaring back, along with Ptolemy and in the later Middle Ages. And so Aquinas does the same thing for Aristotle and Ptolemy that Augustine had done for Plato. And so we have the Ptolemaic model now being wedded to Scripture once again. the Roman Catholic Church gradually began to adopt and accept this cosmology because it works so well. This is the current cosmology of the day. This must be truth. And just about the time that the Roman Catholic Church was really getting its fingers deep into this model and building a foundation on this, a guy named Galileo comes along. And there's a long story here. I don't want to go entirely into it, but Galileo was challenging a number of things. He challenged some Aristotelian thinking. He was challenging the geocentric thinking. He was an ardent heliocentrist. Around 1542, Copernicus has published his book on revolutions, but he had been talking about it for 30 years plus. In his table talks, it's recorded that Luther even referred to this fool. He never named him, this fool who wants to overturn all of astronomy. He was talking about Copernicus, undoubtedly. Now we got to realize that this was recorded years after he actually made the comment, so it's not even Luther's hand. It's a recollection of one of his followers there that wrote about it sometime after the fact. And by the way, was that assessment correct? Was this Copernicus, was he trying to overturn all of astronomy? Well, actually he was. I mean, astronomy at that point was Tulamec, and he was definitely saying, no, it's not geocentric, it's heliocentric, and that big epicycle is no longer necessary. But for the next 75 years after he published, 100 years after Copernicus was talking about it publicly, nobody got upset. Until Galileo comes along. Around 1610 or so thereafter, he starts seeing evidence through the newly invented telescope that suggested to him that the heliocentric model was wrong. One thing he saw was that he saw that Venus goes through phases, and those phases indicate that Venus does not orbit the Earth directly. It must orbit the sun. And once you chip away and admit that one object out there orbits the sun and not the Earth, that's the beginning of the end of the geocentric model. People saw the implications, and he ran with that. And rightfully so. It's a good conclusion. So he started writing and talking about it, and people got upset. Who got upset? Anybody know? Was it the theologians? It wasn't. Who got upset with him? It was the other scientists. That's the thing that everybody misses. It was the other scientists, the theologians were happy with it. The Pope at the time invited, said, this is a good thing for discussion. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it. He welcomed it. But it was the scientists who got in a snit, because what was Galileo doing? Well, just like Copernicus, he was overthrowing all of astronomy. They resented that. It was a scientific revolution. You see, the argument was not Christianity or religion or the Bible at all. The argument was scientific. He was challenging the paradigm of the day. And the other scientists didn't like it. So they complained. And back in even that late of time, this is transitioning from Middle Ages into modern times. But if you wanted to get an education, where did you go? Did you go to state school? No, you went to church schools. If you wanted to get married, did you go to the courthouse and get a marriage license? No, you went to the church, didn't you? If you wanted to be installed as a monarch, where did you go? Are you still a British subject back there? It's been a long time since you've installed a new monarch, but it's going to happen soon, I would think. How old is she now? 96? This is getting on. When her successor goes to be crowned, where will that person go? What? Yeah, she'll go to the Westminster Abbey, will she not? Yeah. Because you see, technically speaking, the UK is a monarchy, and the church determines who the monarch is, technically speaking. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's basically it. It's a vestige of the Middle Ages. And if you wanted to be a ruling monarch or any kind of magistrate stuff, you went to the church. In short, almost everything you did in the Middle Ages, even into the 1600 time period, you went to the church. So the church had a lot of authority, more so than it does today. So who did the offended scientists go run to? The church, of course. They went to the ruling authorities, and they had to sort it out. They had a trial, and they said, okay, cool it there. Don't talk about so much Galileo. You're getting up people upset. Again, it wasn't the theologians. The way you would have it be is religion versus science. Religion sticking its nose where science, where it shouldn't be, in the realm of science. That's not what happened at all. It was one scientist challenging the other scientist, and the other scientist didn't like it. And they just happened to have to go to the authority, which was the Roman Catholic Church, at least in that part of Italy. All right, things calmed down for about 20 years. And then Galileo decided he wanted to take another stab at it. There's a new pope. And so he decided he wanted to write a book. This time he's going to write it in Italian, not in Latin, which was unheard of at the time. It became popular within another 100 years or so, but at the time scholarly things were written in Latin. He wanted to reach a wider audience, so he wrote in a common language. But he had to get permission to publish this because he had been told not to do it. So he went to the church, and they said, fine, go ahead and talk about it. Remember what the church's attitude was? The Pope's attitude had been, let's talk about this. This is worthy of discussion. So he wanted the blessings, and he got the blessings to do it. The Pope said, however, I want you to make sure in your book that you're fair and you first of all, put a disclaimer in there that this is just, hypothetically you're talking about. And also, I want you to reflect my view in the book as well. I'm a geocentrist. I believe in the Tulamec Model. Include that, please. He said, fine, I'll do that. Got to realize that Galileo he was an interesting individual. He tended to have a smart mouth, and it tended to get him in trouble. So he wrote his disclaimer in the front. He said, started off by saying just a little disclaimer in the front. He said, what you're about to read is a fantasy. As any fool knows, the earth does not move. It moves around the sun. The earth moves around the sun. Did you catch that? As any fool knows, the earth doesn't move. It's kind of subtle, isn't it? Until you realize, well, wait a minute. What he's just did is he called anybody who's a geocentrist a fool. His dialogues, which is the name of the book, it's a dialogue between three individuals, one a geocentrist, one a heliocentrist, and then a moderator supposed to be neutral. Turns out he wasn't so neutral. And the geocentrist looked kind of silly in the whole thing, actually downright stupid. And he chose a good name. He had to name each one of them. So the geocentrist, he chose the name Simplicio. You want to guess how that roughly translates into English? Simpleton. Well, when the Pope read the book, he blew up. That's putting it mildly, because he had just dissed the Pope, insulted the Pope. He was outraged. And at that point, the fix was in. That's when the second trial came into play, and that's when the books were banned. People will have you believe, Copernicus wrote this book and it was banned immediately. No, it went for 75 years. It wasn't banned. And even then, it was Galileo's goading and setting the Pope up. If Galileo had not done this, I suspect within another 20 or 30 years, the Roman Catholic Church probably would have come around and abandoned the Tulamec Model. Within 20 or 30 years after this, everybody did anyway. But it took the Roman Catholic Church until the 1990s to actually officially apologize for this and take the books off the ban list. Only about 300 years late or 400 years late in doing this. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. Despite what you've been told about all of this, it was not religion versus science. It was science versus science. Now, a lot of times, our critics out there, the evolutionists, want to say, well, this is just like Galileo all over again. You people are like the Roman Catholic Church, and we're like Galileo, and we know how wrong that was. And I say, hold the process here. What did Galileo do? He challenged the status quo, did he not? What are we creationists trying to do? Challenge the status quo. So if you really want to go there, who's the Galileo in this whole situation today with creation evolution? The creationist are. Who's the Roman Catholic Church? The evolutionists are. People get the lesson wrong. The only thing worse than failing to learn the lessons of history is to learn the wrong lessons of history. And that's exactly what we're doing on this front. All right. We're still living with that albatross today. Again, the Rakia was mistranslated 2,300 years ago, and we're still paying the price. Galileo really stirred the pot and messed things up 400 years ago, and we're still paying the price. 2 lessons from cosmology being endorsed One was the celestial sphere, the stereoma, and the other one was the Tulamec Model. So now we come into the 21st century, late 20th, early 21st century, and all these Christians out there are saying, hey, the Big Bang is found in the Bible. We can interpret the Bible in terms of the Big Bang. And I'm saying, wait a minute, haven't you learned a lesson yet? There's a problem here. So we have a caution. So I talked about this the other day. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it again. There's no need to. Dominant cosmology of the past half century has been the Big Bang. Why did suddenly everybody abandon the steady state model in favor of the Big Bang? What was the discovery in 1965? The cosmic microwave background. See, who said that again? CMB for short, right? That was what won everybody over. It was the one evidence, the one proof, as it were, the one prediction of the Big Bang model that nothing else could do. And it was the belief the universe suddenly appeared 13.8 billion years ago. If I'm asked to define the universe, it's the belief that the universe, matter, energy, space, time suddenly appeared, boom, 13.8 billion years ago in a very hot, dense state, and it's expanded and cooled into the universe that we see today. In a nutshell, that is the Big Bang model. By the way, a lot of misconceptions. I could spend a lot of time on this, but most people tend to think of the Big Bang, they think of space sitting here. Imagine an X, Y, Z coordinate system sitting here, X, Y, and Z, and you got a clock ticking away, but it's empty space, and then at the origin of this X, Y, Z coordinate system at one instant, suddenly matter and energy pop into existence and expands outward into space like this. Is that pretty much what you all think the Big Bang is? The Big Bang happened in one part of the universe, and they spread out into the rest of the universe and keeps expanding into it. That's completely wrong. According to Big Bang thinking, there was no space or time prior to the Big Bang. Sometimes people ask, what was here before the Big Bang? And I'm fond of telling people that, well, here wasn't here then, and then wasn't then either. What I mean by that is when you ask what was here, you're talking about space, right? Well, there was no space, so how can you talk about here? And then when you say before the Big Bang, well, you're talking about before there was time. So if you really want to have, the universe begins with nothing. There was nothing before the universe existed. No space, no time. So really, you actually have quite a bit less than nothing when you think about it. But there was no space, no time, no matter, no energy. Can you even imagine such a thing? And then suddenly there was space, time, matter, and energy. And the matter and energy of the universe filled the universe at the instant it began. Just the universe was a lot smaller back then. Does that make any sense to you? It took me years to get to that point. I began to kind of understand what's going on. Okay, but most people have a gross misconception of the Big Bang, and I have a whole talk on that, but I don't have time for that today. All right. As I pointed out the other day when I gave my talk, I said there are many biblical and scientific problems with it. I asked two questions. What were the two questions I asked? If you're going to use this for your Big Bang apologetic and evangelism, what were the two questions? Is it true and is it biblical? And I argued it fails on both counts. So I already did that. I don't have to do that over again for you today. So here is a map of the CMB. I described that for you. You can see the great the axis of evil over there, and maybe the cold spot if you can find it. And then I've been giving a talk like this for years, a talk about Big Bang cosmology. And I had people ask me questions going back probably at least 25 years. And this is the question. You've got the CMB, right? We measure that, right? Okay, I agree with that. Okay, so you have the CMB, the cosmic microwave background. It was predicted by the Big Bang model, discovered by Penzias and Wilson in 1965, which they got the Nobel Prize for because it was the evidence, the one evidence for the Big Bang. And there's the question people ask me, Danny, if you don't believe in the Big Bang, then where did the CMB come from? And for many years, I had an answer for that. You know what my answer was? I don't know. Which you should never be afraid to say that. If someone asks you a very penetrating, difficult question, and this is a good question to ask me, and I wasn't going to try to blow smoke and tell them that I was going to tell them I don't know. And I found, believe it or not, if people ask you a tough question like that and you're honest and say you don't know, they tend to leave you alone. It's amazing. People sometimes want to make something up to try to, I got to have an answer for that. Well, no, if you don't have an answer, don't make up one on the spot. Admit you have a problem and you're working on it. And for many, many years, I had no answer to that question. But folks, a few years ago, I found an answer to this question. You want to hear the best part? I wasn't even looking for the answer, and it just one morning, pop, there it was. It was amazing. All right. I talked about the scientific problems, the horizon problem, the flatness problem, no magnetic monopoles, asymmetry, matter and antimatter, axis of evil, cold spot. You know all about those now, right? I told you about those the other day, right? Okay, we can go on. All right, and the model continually changes, and I compared that to Tulamec Model. You keep adding epicycles and epicycles, and pretty soon you can change the model at will, and you can't falsify it. If you can't falsify a model, even potentially, then it's not really a scientific concept at all. I've come to the conclusion that the Big Bang is not a scientific concept because it cannot be falsified. They can always make up stuff to fix any problem that comes along. Again, the biblical problem is great time. The order is wrong. Life before the earth, stars before the earth. It's also atheistic in the direction it goes. All the heavy hitters, all the discussions today are about how you can get a Big Bang apart from a God. I think it was almost a decade ago, Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. Anybody heard of the book or read the book? It's really kind of sad. He goes through the book and he argues through the book how this interpretation of physics might lead to this conclusion, and if this is true about the universe, then that might be true, and this could be true, and he puts all this big house of cards together, and voila, I have a universe out of nothing. There's a lot of assuming going into this, a lot of assuming going into it, and he's going to bank his eternal destiny on this. By the way, Lawrence Krauss was the one who very famously said this. It really is maddening when you hear him say this. But he was talking about this theory that astronomers have of how the elements came to be. The universe begins with hydrogen and helium, a little bit of lithium, but that doesn't tell you where the iron in your blood came from and the calcium in your bones came from and the carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, which makes up the bulk of the rest of you, came from. And the theory is all of that was synthesized in countless generations of stars. There were billions of years of stars evolving and spewing the material out into space to recycle and do it again and again and again, working up to finally, after 9 billion years, the solar system forms. We have the primordial soup on the Earth, which evolves into life, and after 3.5 billion years, here we are. Big, long chain like this. And he says that's one of the most poetic things he's ever heard in all of science. He said because the calcium in your bones and the iron in your blood and so forth came forged in stars. So he said, and I'm going to quote him here, don't get upset with me, but you should be righteously indignant what he said. He said, forget Jesus. The stars died so you could be here today. That's offensive. That is offensive. Should be offensive to Christians. That's the kind of thinking that Big Bang has led to. Okay, let's look at the creation account then. And what I did is when I went to work at AIG 8 years ago, the cool thing is I've been doing creation science kind of part-time for years. Now I'm a full-time researcher. That's part of my job title. And so when I got there, I had a long list of things I wanted to investigate. I've made this list before, and I just didn't have time to do it all. Now I'm being paid just to sit around and think about stuff like this. And one of my things was to finally try to figure out the cosmology of Genesis 1 as best I could. And that was the direction I was taking. I was just trying to figure out what this rakia is, and this other thing fell into my lap. Okay, in the beginning, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. All right, that's the first point. Then on day 2, God made this firmament or expanse. That's my second point. I already talked about this a little bit. And then I have to ask the question, what about this firmament and what about this heaven? Well, the word firmament is translation of rakia, which occurs 17 times in the Old Testament. So if you want to know what a word means many times, it helps to look up the other times. So I see it first appear in Genesis 1. Okay, let's look up the other times it occurs. Well, the problem is 9 of those times are in Genesis 1 itself. That means over half the times that word is used, it's found in the very context I'm trying to figure out what it means. That's not good. It's also found in the book of Psalms twice, I believe, a book of Daniel, and then it's found 5 times in the book of Isaiah, but I am thoroughly convinced the times it's found in the, Ezekiel, not Isaiah, the book of Ezekiel, the 5 times there, it's talking about something very different. It's not talking about the rakia of day 2. So already I'm in trouble because it doesn't really tell me what I think I'm trying to find. Now, the word heaven is a little different. It's the word Shimayim, and it occurs 420 times in the Old Testament. It's found quite liberally there, and it's usually translated heaven or heavens 398 times. There's a little, if you even look at Genesis 1:1, some translations say heaven, and some of them say heavens. And anybody noticed that before? Been confused by that, maybe? Do you know why it's translated heavens in some plural and sometimes singular? Well, you know anything about Hebrew? Look at that word Shimayim. What do you notice about it? Anybody know? Look at the ending of the word. What does that tell you? It means it's a plural. And many times when you get that "im" ending on a word, it's just appended to it from the singular. The problem is there is no singular form of this one. It's a dual form. There is no singular form. And in Hebrew, it perfectly makes sense to do this. But in English, we don't have the benefit of that. It's either heaven or heavens. The best example I can give, and it's probably not a good one, is the word deer. All right? And deer can be singular. You can have a deer. You can have two or more deer. And it's ambiguous sometimes which one it is. If I were to say, look at the deer, how many deer am I talking about? No idea, because it's the object of a sentence. But if I said, the deer is eating, how many deer do I have? If the deer are eating, how many do I have? Two or more, all right? You see, when it's a subject of a sentence, you can look at the verb, and the verb will tell you. And that's pretty cool, because in Hebrew, oftentimes you can go by the verb. The problem is, in over 400 of the times, it's the object of the sentence. So it's rarely the subject. A few times it is. In Psalm 19:1, it is the subject of the sentence. The heavens declare the glory of God, and I think every translation gives you plural there. But again, it's a sense of the translator. What do you think is meant there? So if they think it's plural, then they put plural. If they don't think it's plural, they put singular. So that's kind of tricky already too. Okay, what does this rakia mean? It comes from the verb raka. You oftentimes will make nouns out of verbs. And it means to stamp out. So there's a few places where that term is used in the Old Testament where you can stomp things down like this. I'm rakaing right now. You can stamp like that. You can also take, stamping the foot will do that. You can also take a hammer or something and you can pound a metal such as gold or brass or bronze and stretch it out as you do that. So people sometimes say, aha, this is often applied to a metal. Metals are hard, therefore this thing must be hard. We're right back to stereoma. We're back to a sphere or a dome over the earth, right? Well, not so fast. Is gold hard? Anybody here ever handled any pure gold, 24 karat gold? You can dent it pretty easily. You've seen old movies where somebody's paid with a coin and they take the coin and they bite it like this. You ever seen people do that? You know what they're doing? They're biting that to make sure it's a gold coin. If it's a 24 karat gold coin, biting it will actually dent it. It's that soft. So gold is not very hard at all, as it turns out. Well, here's where they also mess up. When they try to say that raka means to rakia, since it derives from raka, and the object of the verb, the action, is often a metal which has the property of being hard, then this thing, necessarily the rakia, must be hard. That is the claim that people make. But the problem is, whenever you make a noun out of a verb, it's never a property of the object of the action of the verb that you're looking at. It's always something imparted, a property imparted by the action of the verb itself. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. I looked this up. It's marvelous how this works in English. The word expand, it comes from the French. That is a verb. You understand what expand means, right? So if you expand something, then it becomes an expanse, doesn't it? Expanse is a noun that derives from the verb. You see how well this works? Now, many things that you expand, day one, day two, he expands something off of the earth. He uses this to be a separator, a divider. Some people say it has to be a physical divider. I disagree. It simply says to separate between them. You don't actually have to have a physical barrier between. Some people want to make that the rakia a physical barrier. It doesn't say that. It simply says something between them, interposing between these two bodies of water. So there's water beneath and there's water above. What is this water above? Well, that would be very telling, because that probably has to do with how you're going to resolve this issue. How you decide what the waters above are will tell you what the rakia is, and the way you figure out what the rakia is, you're going to tell you what the waters above are. You see the kind of circular problem you have here in this. God didn't make the stars till day 4, but he put it in this thing he made on day 2. We're going to see in just a moment. Now I want to draw back something here. Notice what was the first verse? What does the first verse of Genesis say? And God, tell me folks, in the beginning God heavens, or heaven and the earth. And then on verse 8, it says, God had already just made the expanse, and it says, and God called the expanse heaven. Did you catch that? Question. Did God create the heavens twice? In verse 1 and then on the day 2 account? See my question? It says in verse 1, God made the heavens and the earth. And then in verse 6, he says he makes this expanse. Verse 7, he describes more about it. In verse 8, he says he called this expanse heaven. Well, that sounds like God made heaven twice, doesn't it? There's no contradiction here. We have to make sense of it, but I don't think there's a contradiction here. How you resolve that little question also is very telling as well. All right, let's take a look at the day 4 account, see if this helps at all. It says, part of verse 14 says, let there be lights in the rakia of the Shimayim. And in verse 15 it says, and let them be for lights in the rakia of Shimayim. And God, in verse 17, and God set them in the rakia of the Shimayim. Notice the construction there. English, King James, firmament of heaven, expansive heaven, and more modern translations I like to use, kind of mix the English and the Hebrew, rakia of Shimayim. Notice that he puts those two together. Why are they put together? And also he mentions them not once, not twice, but 3 times. Why does he mention it 3 times? When something is mentioned 3 times, oftentimes in Scripture, but elsewhere, if something's mentioned 3 times, what does that usually signify? It's important, yeah. When something is mentioned 3 times, what does that mean? And mentioned 3 times, what does it mean? We get the point. All right. When something is mentioned more than once, 3 times particularly, it's important. It's like, hey, look at this. This is important. Read it. Pay attention to it. And I miss this many times. Finally, one day I think, oh, duh. 3 times it's important. Why did he put okay, it's 3 times, so pay attention, Danny. You got to pay attention to what's saying here. And then the two are put together. Expanse of the heaven, or firmament of heaven, or rakia of Shemayim. Why are they put together? I think they were put together lest there be any doubt. God put the luminaries, the heavenly lights, the heavenly body, heavenly astronomical bodies, in the thing he made on day 2. That makes sense. On day 2. All right, so day 5, one more time it's mentioned, only once here. This is talking about the birds. It says, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Now that open part is a little addition that didn't exist in day 4 account. But the word there, pene, in Hebrew, is the same word that is used in verse 2 when it talks about the Spirit of God moving on the face of the waters, the surface, the interface, the near surface of this thing. So when I see this on day 5, it talks about the birds not flying in the expanse of heaven where the heavenly bodies are, but on the near face of it. So whatever this thing is, the astronomical bodies are in it, and the birds are flying in front of it, on the near side of it, maybe just inside of it, part of it, but not very deep at all into that. Subtleties you can pick up if you start really deeply digging into this. By the way, I'm throwing some Hebrew words out there. I am not a Hebraist. I've never studied Hebrew, but I know a lot of people who do, and they've helped me a lot. I know a couple of world-class Hebraists, and I pump them for information every time I have a question. Okay. Next time the firmament is mentioned, the rakia is in Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Notice the parallel structure that oftentimes happens in the Proverbs and in the Psalms. You say something one way and you say it another. So you see here this parallelism only works if the heavens and the firmament, or the rakia, Shemayim and rakiam, are to be equated with one another. Well, big duh, we were told that in verse 8 of chapter 1, and God called the rakia Shimayim, so this just reinforces what we already knew. It's also mentioned very late in the Psalms. It's very clear it's talking about the same thing. Daniel, it's very clear it's talking about the same thing. When you get to Ezekiel, it's not clear at all it's talking about that. All right, and by the way, verses 4 and 6 of Psalm 19 very clearly place the sun inside of this thing being talked about. Again, reinforcing, agreeing with what we learned in the day 4 account in chapter 1 of Genesis. All right, conclusion, not of my talk, but just what the rakia is. The expanse is where the astronomical bodies are. Now, I pointed out in my talk yesterday, I believe, and also today, we need to be very careful that we don't interpret Scripture in terms of our current cosmology. I'm well aware of that. But I'm a product of my time, 20th and now 21st century. So I try to struggle and interpret things and understand things in terms of, I can't help that. That's what I am. But if I'm aware of the problem, I'm aware of my biases, then at least I can have some caution here. So since the expanse is where the astronomical bodies are, let's try to put it in 20th century parlance, modern thinking. Where are the astronomical bodies? Well, how would we say it today? Where are they? Space. So my conclusion is that the rakia probably is space as we know it, a modern concept, and probably the atmosphere as well. This is a good deal. Things basically above us that we can see. Now, this has not been the approach of many 20th century creationists. Many 20th century creationists said the heavens of day one was the space of the universe. I don't believe that anymore. I did for many years. And they say the expanse of day two is the Earth's atmosphere. I don't believe that anymore either. This was done by Henry Morris and John Whitcomb to support what's called the Canopy Model. You all heard of the Canopy Model? Okay, a few of you have. It's something that was widely believed among creationists 40 and 50 years ago, but each creation ministry has gradually moved away from that. Answers in Genesis has never endorsed this model. And the idea that there was a vapor canopy over top of the earth that protected it from harmful rays and so forth, and is used to try to answer a lot of supposed problems like longevity before the flood and why there was no rain before the flood. The Bible doesn't say that. Why there was no rainbow before the flood. The Bible doesn't say that, and so it goes. But the vapor canopy collapsed down to help cause the flood, and there are some problems with that. Physically, it doesn't work, but also even biblically, because the end of the Psalms, Psalm 148, I believe, it says, "Praise ye waters above the heavens." It's a post-flood psalm. We don't know who wrote it, but it wasn't pre-flood. We're pretty certain. Why was the psalmist, after the flood, praising the waters, asking them to praise God above the heavens if they're not there anymore? Whatever these waters are, I think they're still there. Anyway, the Canopy Model is largely rejected today, and I think it's high time we reevaluate the cosmology that we've built here. And I think what happened is, even though the creation ministries, one by one, over the decades, got away from the Canopy Model, they never went back and tried to reevaluate the cosmology of chapter 1. I was stunned when I realized that. I thought, whoa, it fell to me? I can't believe that I've got this fertile field in front of me that no one's in the creation science movement has even touched. So here's what I concluded. Straightforward reading of Genesis 1. Expanse is space and probably the atmosphere too. What is the creation of Genesis 1:1? Well, it's an example of heaven and earth being a merism. A merism is talking about the two extremes and everything in between. If I said I looked high and low for something, does that mean that I looked on the top shelf and on the bottom shelf and that was it? No, when I went high and low, I went top and bottom and everything in between, right? Heaven and earth is a merism that encapsulates everything. There's no word in the ancient Hebrew meaning universe. This is probably the closest. In the beginning, God made the universe. God made everything. It's an example of an introductory encapsulation. It's an introduction and then details to follow. There are other examples of that in Genesis. For instance, Joseph, it said, "And Joseph dreamed another dream, and his brothers hated him all the more so because of the dream." Well, that's pregnant with a lot of questions. Why? What did he dream, and why did they hate him because of that? Well, then it goes on in the next few verses and explains what the dream was and why his brothers didn't like it. You had an introductory encapsulation and then the details to follow. Same thing going on here. There's an introductory encapsulation, details to follow, and it's summed up in the first 3 verses of chapter 2 at that point. So the creation account really runs from Genesis 1:2 to Genesis 2:3. If you wanted to redo the chapter breaks, that was where you ought to move that one. Okay. Interesting development. When I came to realize this about 6 years ago, I immediately realized 3 startling conclusions, and they really rocked my world. Number 1, it tells me the universe has an edge. Because the rakia is space, and God expanded it outward from the earth on day 2, and I presume it went someplace and stopped. Somebody had a question last night they gave to me that said, do you think the universe is finite or infinite? I think it's finite. Answer that question, right? Sneak that one in today. Didn't answer it last night because I was going to answer it today, so we saved time. So the universe has an edge to it, and which means it's finite in size. But you realize that both of those concepts are really anathema in modern cosmology, particularly an edge. When I say the universe has an edge, it means you get to the edge and you can't go any further. It's like a wall of some sort there. And you have to wonder, well, what's the nature of this wall? What's beyond this wall? And we have no idea. But there's an edge to it. And that really was contrary to my thinking for like 40 years. Also, since it expanded away from the Earth, then if the Earth has an edge, then there must be a center. And since it expanded off the Earth, guess what? The Earth just happens to be near the center. It's just the nature of the way God expanded it off. Don't have to be absolutely at the center, but we're somewhere near the center, which, again, that's anathema to modern cosmology. But then this one's really cool. You have this expanse with water above, and so there must be water out at the edge of the universe with the expanse between, space in between. So now what we have is the Earth sitting here. You've got this big, roughly spherical, I'll call it, space around it, the universe, the Rakia, and then there's water up above like this at that point, and that's the creation. Must be pretty far away from us. And why did God put water there? Well, I don't know. Interesting, but that's taking seriously what he said at that point. So I cogitated on this, had a lot of conversations, a lot of study, and 6 years or so ago, and I worked on this. And then when I finally get an idea put together, I sit down and I start writing it up. I wrote a paper for our online Answers Research Journal. That's for more technical papers, but this is not super technical. It's not really scientific too much, but a lot of biblical stuff that I ran past some other people better than those kind of questions, and I had to make sure I was on balance with this, completely peer-reviewed and so forth. And I remember the day, I wish I had written down the date, but I remember the day I went into the office one morning, about 7:30 or so. I sat down and I start working. I'm typing this up. And out of a bolt out of the blue, suddenly it hit me. And again, I wasn't looking for it. I was looking, Lord, tell me what the true biblical cosmology is. And suddenly one morning, I said, wait a minute. I suddenly realized something. I realized that water is made out of baryonic matter. That's a very fancy, schmancy term, which simply means made out of protons, neutrons, and electrons. And one thing we know about normal baryonic matter is that if it has temperature greater than absolute zero, which by the fourth law of thermodynamics we know it must. You didn't know there's a fourth law, did you? Well, there is. And if it's above absolute zero, then it must radiate. It may not radiate very brightly or very long, short wavelengths, but it will radiate. So if the Earth is sitting here and there's a shell of water at great distance, and that water should be radiating energy towards us like this. There should be a radiation field coming from every direction. Now, I talked about the Hubble relation. I said he's credited with discovering that the universe is expanding, but in reality, what he did was he showed that there was a correlation between redshift and distance. And so if this radiation is coming from every direction in space towards us from very, very, very far away, then if the Hubble relation is true, and I know that it is, then that light coming to us must be redshifted, which shifts it even to cooler wavelengths. I don't know how much has been redshifted because I don't have a good model. You see where I'm going already, I can tell. And so I see this prediction then coming from this biblical cosmology is that there should be a cool radiation field coming from every direction in space, a uniform radiation field from every direction in space. You mean like the CMB? That was the great, I wasn't looking for it moment. That was exciting, folks. Just, wait a minute. I'm sitting in my office, wait a minute. And I was trying to find what kind of cosmology does Genesis 1 teach? And this was given to me in my lap as a bonus. I think the Lord really kind of showed that to me, maybe. But I wasn't looking. All those years I've been asked this question, and I just kind of put it off because I had no clue. And I'm looking at something I thought was totally unrelated, and actually it's the key to getting this. So now, when people ask me this question, I tell them, yes, this is what the CMB is. Now, can we make some predictions to test in this? I think we can, because it is water, and maybe it'll have certain spectral features. In part of the spectrum, we're not looking at this point. However, I don't believe that is my job to do. I think somebody else is going to do this. I have to have a sense of my place, my legacy, and who's going to follow and what they're going to do. So if some of you people are inclined to go into astronomy, I'm not getting any younger, as you can see. About the time you're ready, going to grad school and stuff, maybe I'll be ready to move off and you can come work at Answers in Genesis and answer this question beyond my abilities at this point. But I'm really excited because I now have an answer to that question, and it all comes from an attempt to look at the proper biblical cosmology. All right, I do have a book called Universe by Design. We don't have it selling there. And by the way, I wrote that 15 years ago, and I've changed my mind about a few things. Like, for instance, this idea I've shared with you is not in this book, I'm afraid. I really badly need to revise that book, but I don't know if we ever will do that. We'll have to see. And then I do want to mention, but they had the book table out there. I noticed, I went by, the price is several dollars less than the SRP. My 3 books that they do have, if you were looking for a bargain, you're not going to find a better bargain out there. And if you're worried about paying shipping, of course, you just walk with it. So those books are available out there. In the Creative Cosmos, I do have a chapter dealing with this subject on there. And also we have the Expansive Heaven as well. It's kind of a companion book for it. And both of them are discounted about $5 over the SRP. Even the Flat Earth book is discounted, I think, about $3 or $4 as well. So anyway, it's time for me to shut up so you can go play water balloons. Yeah. Got a couple of closing comments.
Okay, it wasn't that good. It wasn't that good. Okay, I tell you what, it's 10:02, so let's just go ahead and have our water balloon fight and throw our water balloons at Dr. Faulkner up there in 10 minutes' time. So yeah, is that okay? 3 o'clock for what? You still want 3:15? Okay, forget that. Let's stick to 3:15. 3:15 water balloon fight. 3:30 is soccer. Other announcements?
Anyone who still needs to sign up for auditions, now's the time. If you are doing a song, you need copies of the lyrics to be given in today.
Everybody hear that? So the auditions are tomorrow afternoon, but if you're doing song, then please submit a copy of your lyrics to me or Pastor Warhurst today, please. And that's it. Okay, enjoy your break.
Because your name tags are likely to get destroyed in the water balloon, you can take your name tags, set them aside. Just don't lose them.
Okay. Name tags off for the water fight.